Well, we're very pleased that Bradley is going to talk about Winter Tree ID. He is a Maryland Native Plant Society board member and the habitat manager at Nature Forward. He's a graduate from the University of Maryland College Park, where he earned a BS in environmental science and policy, concentrating in wildlife ecology and management. His work in the plant field has included research as well as active management of an urban forest. He has conducted urban forest research in New York City and at Wood End Nature Sanctuary, categorizing thousands of plants in the process. Currently, he manages the restoration of Wood End's natural habitats, specifically the 29 acres of forest, and shares his knowledge of plants through many education programs. He is also in the process of obtaining a master's degree from UMD to deepen his understanding of urban forest ecology. So thank you, Bradley. And why don't you take it away at this point?
Thank you so much, Judy. For those who aren't familiar, Woodland Nature Sanctuary is a property in Chevy Chase, Maryland. It is a private property owned by the organization Nature Forward, and it's open to the public. Feel free to visit. Lots of great stuff going on there, and that's where I usually spend my 9 to 5s. But I also like to be here in the evenings to share any knowledge that I have on specifically on tree identification. That's what I like to talk about. Winter trees. We talked about skunk cabbage being up right now, but other than the exciting heat generating skunk cabbage, there's not as much to look at, but my favorite thing to look at in the winter are trees, particularly the winter identifying features, the bark, the buds, and maybe even some fruit that are hanging around to provide food for our wildlife throughout the winter. So we're going to talk about all of those things. We're going to go through at the beginning some terminology and parts of twigs, parts of bark, and differentiating between the positioning of buds. And then we'll kind of do a little practice thing. Well, hopefully we can associate what we learned to some practice twigs I have pictures of. And then I will kind of go through some really common trees at the end and talk about their identifying winter features. And then at the very last part of it of our presentation is going to be just a run through of my favorite introductory dichotomous key for winter tree identification, the Winter Tree Finder, the nice pocket book that's available for very inexpensive online for like $5-6. Right. So we already went through this. I'm not going to introduce myself again, but this is me if you haven't seen a picture with the this is the big live oak that's outside Charleston. I think it's the angel oak. Yeah. So identifying trees in the winter, we have characteristic features that are typically bark, thorns, maybe a type of fruit, but also we can have some positioning of buds, of certain bud features like the numbers of scales or the color of the buds, how hairy they are. These characteristic features are associated in dichotomous keys, where they call out these characteristic features to help you identify our species. So the Winter Tree Finder that I mentioned here by Mary Thielgard Watts and Tom Watts is a great source. Of course, there are apps. Virginia Tech Dendrology is one of my favorites. And I will say iNaturalist, with its ability to identify plants, is getting pretty good at doing identification through winter tree features. Of course, there's our Flora Virginia, but typically those keys focus on our summer characteristics like leaves and flowers. So Winter Tree Finder only uses the winter characteristics available to us this time of year. For more of a expanded guide that will include really any woody plant east of the Mississippi and north of Florida. My favorite is the Keys to Woody Plants, an expanded guide by Edward A. Cope. This will do really any woody plant that's in a yard, cultivated, landscaped, naturalized, native east of the Mississippi. So plenty of stuff, and it has winter features in there too. And of course, you might need some other tools like hand lens rulers for measuring, a knife or pruner to either collect some twigs or to look inside. We'll talk a little bit about the pith later. And of course, trees are tall. You might need some binoculars to see those hard to reach features. I can never do a tree talk without talking first about taxonomy. I think it's very important that as you learn your trees, not only to learn like the identifying features, but what family are they a part of? How are they related to each other? And then we can start to see patterns and associate some characteristics that are common in families to help us identify things in the future. For example, our Fagaceae, the beech family, which includes oaks and beeches and chestnuts, they all have leaves that typically turn brown and persist on stems through the winter. Olive family species are oppositely arranged, like ash and fringe tree, as well as some non-natives like privet. Our cherry genus Prunus has horizontal lenticels on our bark. And of course, our classic oaks all have acorns and buds clustered at the ends of twigs. So as we start to learn our trees and associate them with their families, we can really learn the features that separate them from others and help us identify things quicker in the future. Botany is its own language. There are lots of terms. There's an entire book on just plant identification terminology. I highlighted a few that are really going to be important for us today, like pubescent, meaning hairy, or glabrous, meaning smooth. Terminus, related to the positioning, particularly in our case, a bud is going to be at the end of a stem, or a bud will be axillary, where it's along the stem. And I'll show some pictures on how that axillary term is applied. Leaf scars are the scars remaining on a twig after a leaf falls. When the leaf detaches from a stem, it leaves a scar where the petiole was attached. The petiole being the leaf stem. The bundle scars are the remnants of the vascular tissue found within the leaf scar, so that the xylem and phloem that exchange water and nutrients between the leaves and the stem, they also leave their own scars within the leaf scar that can be identifiable. So here are some examples of important winter features. Twigs, you can have color, texture, maybe even the smell, the size, color, number of scales, maybe the difference between flower buds or leaf buds, the type, color, and pattern of bark, the size and distinctive features of fruits. And of course, there are some fallen leaves that are available. Even though wind moves things around, it is nice to know that if you have a leaf that matches your suspicion for a tree species, it's helpful, and it's nice to know that you're probably on the right track. So I'll point out the pawpaw flower buds here. We have our nice spherical flower buds versus our more longer pointed vegetative bud that we see on the stems of our pawpaws this time of year. The thick plated flowering dogwood bark, and the aggregates of our winged seeds called samaras that sit at the ends of twigs of our tulip trees are some of my favorite winter features. No matter if you're identifying trees in winter, spring, summer, fall, the first question you're always going to have to ask yourself is the arrangement of the leaves. Now, in the winter, instead of the arrangement of the leaves, you're really just asking yourselves, what is the arrangement of the leaf scars? You have to imagine the leaves being there, but at least the scars are available for you to look at. So we can have three options. We have trees that are alternately arranged, so leaves or leaf scars are occurring one at a time along a stem. Or we have opposite, leaves are occurring in pairs along the stem. Or we have leaves that are whorled, which is three or more at a time along the stem. There are only two species, one genera, that are very commonly whorled in terms of our trees, and those are our catalpas. They are always whorled, always three leaf scars per position on the stem. So we have our northern and our southern catalpas here. They are technically not Maryland natives, but they are very common in the landscape, and very beautiful white flowers. The ones with the really long pod-like fruits that dangle and move in the wind in the winter. If we have an oppositely arranged species, we are in luck. It actually will be a lot easier to identify. Our list of options for oppositely arranged species is much smaller than our list of options for species that are alternately arranged. So I like to use this little mnemonic to remember my very common oppositely arranged species. I remember Mad Vibes Lonnie, Mad relating to maples for M, ashes for A, and dogwoods for D. Vibes relates to viburnum. Lonnie is related to the genus name Lonicera for honeysuckle. And of course, is where I'm going to bring back taxonomy. You can actually lump in additional species based off of, again, their taxonomic relationships. So elderberry is in the same family as viburnum, so we can include that together in our minds for a mnemonic. The buckeyes and horse chestnut genus Aesculus is in the same family as our maples in the Sapindaceae. And ashes are related to our fringe trees in the olive family. So again, we can start to relate some of our other opposite species based off of this more simple mnemonic. So here's an example of what our opposite arrangement looks like with leaves. We have our honeysuckle, our maples, and our paired leaves of dogwood. But in the winter, the opposite arrangement is not just for the leaves, it can be for the stems as well. So even the stem arrangement that when you look up at a tree will be opposite for opposite arranged species. Now, it is important to look at multiple points to see this opposite arrangement because you want to ensure that there is consistency because there will be times where there's a alternate or a one twig instead of a pair. And this can happen for a multitude of reasons. The twig breaks, gets broken off, maybe got eaten, or it just falls off for whatever reason. But if you have more than one pair of twigs along your stem, you can pretty confidently say that your tree is oppositely arranged. So this is an ash tree showing off its opposite arrangement in the winter. You can even start to see the outlines of the buds too along the stem. So let's look at a twig more closely. At the end of our twigs, we have our terminal bud. And along the twig, we have our axillary buds. So there's alternative words that we can use. We can also say terminal or apical bud, axillary or lateral bud. Those are synonyms for each other. Anytime where there's a leaf scar or a bud, we call it a node. It just relates to the position where there is a leaf scar. And those are really the most important terms. There are other distinctions between, you can actually see the difference in years growth based off of the scars left by the terminal bud scales, so the twig scars. But really the most important are the positioning of the buds, the leaf scar, and then of course you can even use bud scales and the number of those scales to help identify as well. So again, just to really hone in on our terminal versus axillary, this graphic shows the synonym terms, apical and terminal for the bud at the end, axillary or lateral bud for the bud that sits in between the leaf and the stem, which is called the axil. Again, just to look at what this axil is. In the winter, we have to kind of imagine the leaf being there, forming that other side of this space called an axil between the stem and the leaf. And this is where the term axillary comes from, within the axil. But it's really just any bud that's along a stem and not at the tip of the stem. Flower buds and leaf buds, there can be a difference. Flower buds typically are much more conspicuous. They're rounder, spherical. On some species, they'll even open before leaf buds. And the vegetative buds tend to be more pointed, less significant, and much smaller and inconspicuous. So we can see this distinction this time of year when we can really see the flower buds getting ready to open come spring and summer. But there are buds that include both leaves and flowers that have all the energy required for next season's growth. For example, the terminal buds in horse chestnut and buckeyes have this characteristic, as well as the terminal buds of sweet gum and the large, long, pointed buds of our beech trees. Lots of energy held within those larger buds. There are some interesting cases where at the ends of the twigs, we have a bud that's at the end of the twig. So it would be a terminal bud, but it's actually kind of lying. It's like faking being a terminal bud because the stem actually continued. And the stem instead died and fell off, leaving this axillary bud at the end of the stem. So it has two scars on either side. And sometimes keys will ask about a pseudoterminal bud, an axillary bud that's faking being a terminal bud because it's at the new end of the stem. Harlow's Fruit and Twig Key, another one of my favorite books from the 1940s for winter tree identification, does call out the ability to identify a pseudoterminal bud on some species. So we look into the scars of where leaves used to be. The leaf scar, again, is remaining on the twig after the leaf falls. And within these darker points here on this example are the bundle scars. In this case, the bundle scars do leave a very conspicuous shape and a very conspicuous form that helps us to identify our species. In this case, the black walnut, Juglans nigra, has this leaf scar and bundle scar characteristic that relates, a lot of people relate it to the face of like a monkey. So these features can help us to identify too. Typically, I like to say big leaves leave big leaf scars. So if we can imagine the 1 foot long compound leaves of black walnut attached to this larger leaf scar here. And just to remember our terminology that I mentioned earlier, we can see the hairs on this stem. We would call the stem pubescent or hairy. And there are like 20 different words to tell you how hairy something is or in what way is it hairy. But pubescent is just the nice general term for saying it is hairy. Inside a stem, we can look at the pith. The pith is a spongy central tissue that is found in some stems and roots. For our woody plant identification, we can have a pith being solid, or in the case of a walnut, it can be chambered, having these little gaps within, or it can even be hollow. I see a lot of hollow pith, particularly in our honeysuckles. Some even have conspicuous shapes. When you cut the stem and look at the pith, you can see the shape of it. So oaks are, I think, the most characteristic one, having a star-shaped or five-sided shaped pith inside. So you can see that star shape and the little darker tissue within the stem of an oak tree. Lenticels are additional features along the stem. They are one of many raised pores in the stem of a woody plant, and they exchange gas between the atmosphere and the internal tissues within the stems. They can have particular shapes. They can have particular sizes. I think my favorite are the spice bush lenticels. You can see the shadows created by the raised pores along the stem, particularly along the more mature stems of our spice bush. But of course, the horizontal lenticels that are a little bit harder to see on our black cherry as the bark becomes more scaly. And then the diamond-shaped ones that we see on our non-native white poplar. Thorns and other protuberances that we see on our stems and bark are other ways to identify our woody plants in the winter. So a thorn is a stiff, woody, modified stem. When I say modified stem, it means that within that thorn, there is vascular tissue. There is tissue within that thorn that can exchange nutrients and water with the rest of the plant. So a great example of that are the really terrifying thorns of honey locusts. Spines are a modified leaf, so they're more leafy in feature in where they're derived from. So black locust, a pair of spines on young stems. I'll show a picture of differentiating the thorn, spine, and prickle on the next slide. So a prickle is just a sharp outgrowth of the epidermis. So it's just the outer layer of the stem forming this really prickly feature. Example of that would be rose. So of course I can't go through a presentation without saying every rose does not have its thorn, it has its prickle. Wings are a thin flange of tissue that extend beyond the normal outline. So we can see the wings on young stems of sweet gum, as well as a very characteristic feature of our non-native burning bush, Euonymus alatus literally meaning winged. Or on the bark of our hackberry, a wart, a very firm protuberance. Here we can see a side-by-side difference between our thorns. This is thorns on young honey locusts. So they're just starting to branch out a little bit, but still terrifying. The outgrowth of the epidermis, the prickle of our rose, and then the paired spines. These are modified leaves of our black locusts. And then an additional one, the bristles. So here on our Rubus phenoclasius, the wineberry, nice, horrible, invasive, we have a mixture of these straight prickles and these hair-like features called bristles. So a bristle is just a short, stiff hair or hair-like feature along a stem, on a leaf, can be even on the reproductive features within a plant. So I think the distinction with these that are most important, thorns and spines, because they are modified stems or leaves, they have to occur nearby a node or a bud or leaf scar. Whereas a prickle on a rose can occur anywhere along the stem because it's just, again, an outgrowth of that stem. The close-up look at the bristles of wineberry. These are very interesting because they're actually tipped with glands. You can see this like little spherical feature. So these are glandular tipped hairs, and we actually do see them commonly on our blackberries and raspberries, and they secrete sugary substances that attract insects. The glands are much more noticeable in the summer as they are in the process of attracting those insects. The bark types, these bark types are taken from the Bark book, A Field Guide to the Trees in the Northeast, a great resource for really honing in on identifying trees only using the bark features. So these definitions separate the types of bark that we see commonly in our region. It is a great book. I will note that because of Maryland's location in the mid-Atlantic and our flora having some species that are more common of the southeast, this book is not going to have all the trees that we find here in Maryland. For example, it does not have persimmon. That will not be included in this book. So our bark types, according to Michael Wojtek, include smooth, unbroken bark like that of our beech tree. We can have bark that's peeling in curly strips like the river birch. Bark with visible lenticels like our cherries. Here's the visible lenticels of our cherries. Or those with vertical cracks and seams. And one of the ones he points to for that one is hickory. And we can see the cracks forming almost in these diamond shapes, and then the red color within, very identifiable for our hickory species. We have scales. Scales are roughly similar size, but they're brittle. They can be easily broken off the tree. So black cherry has scales. Plates are scales, but larger and typically thicker and much more challenging to like scrape off of the outside of the bark. So flowering dogwood is plated bark. Vertical strips at least 3 times longer than wide, like our red maple. And then we have differences in ridged and furrowed. So we have ridge and furrowed bark that can be intersecting a lot, like in our ash trees, where the ridges, the tops of the bark and the furrows are like the valleys inside the darker areas where they're intersecting very consistently, like our ash. We can have ridges broken horizontally, like our black oak, or ridges that run for a very long time without being interrupted by another ridge, like that of our red oak. You can see these nice long, um, usually described as like a ski slope pattern of our northern red oak. So then I will just go ahead and mention a few of our fruit anatomy. A lot of what we see in winter are our dry fruits because the fleshy fruits tend to not be available except for some particular species like winterberry holly. But dry and dehiscent fruits are those that at maturity, the fruit is dry, but it doesn't open on its own. So a good example of this would be a nut, like a walnut or an acorn. We can have fruits that are dry and dehiscent. So when they're mature, they actually open on their own, like a legume or a capsule. And then fleshy fruits, again, we don't see as many of them in our winter months, but our common ones are drupes with the stone inside. The berry, it's not stony in the middle, but blueberry is a great example. And the one that's not listed here is a pome, like an apple, where it has a tough central core with seeds. I just want to take a second to really practice what we learned about bud position and some of our twig anatomy and apply it to three stem examples that I collected. So here at the end, I'll give a second for us to like think about it and then I'll keep going. But here at the end, we have a bud that is terminal or apical bud. Here along the stem is going to be axillary or lateral. These are alternating as well. This is an alternately arranged species. We have buds occurring one at a time. Our axillary buds occur one at a time. Here, these larger points along the stem are remnants of our leaves. And then a feature within the leaf scar, the little dots that are kind of hard to see are the bundle scars. And this is a feature that I haven't talked about yet, but is actually very identifiable for the magnolia family, is a stipular scar. So this is a scar that leaves a line that encircles the entire stem. And this line that goes around the stem completely is very characteristic of our magnolia family species. So this is tulip tree, Liriodendron tulipifera, which is in the magnolia family. So if we find a sweet bay magnolia, cucumber magnolia, they're all going to have these stipular scars that encircle the entire stem. We have a kind of a thinner stem here, so some of our features might be harder to see. At the ends of our twigs, we have a smaller stem, so some of our features might be a little bit more challenging to see, but the buds at the end of the stem are still going to be terminal. In this case, they're actually not. There's not just one. There's two terminal buds. We have axillary buds along the side. So this is a very interesting non-native woody plant that I've noticed always ends in a pair of terminal buds, which I think is very interesting. This is our Japanese maple, Acer palmatum, which at Woodland Sanctuary is our most common non-native tree in our forest. So it's good to be able to recognize these identifying features in the winters as we do some invasive plant management. Always the stems, you can even see here on this smaller offshoot stem that the still ends in a pair of terminal buds, always two. Here we also have more than one terminal bud. The clustering of buds of our white oak in this case. Our buds occurring alternately along the stem are axillary. And then, of course, the remnants of our leaf scars. I will say, when I talked about the ability to look at a tree's stem arrangement and associating between alternate and opposite by looking at the stems of, and the example I showed earlier was ash. Now, I will say oaks can be a little tricky because of those clustering of terminal buds. As these buds open and become stems, because they're so close together, they can appear, the stems can appear opposite. You can actually see it down here in this example. So because at this point here, the stems look opposite because the buds were so close together when they opened. So you, again, should have to always want to look very closely at our arrangements to be sure that we are confident that something is alternate or opposite. So in discussing oaks, there's a great feature we can look at for differentiating between our red oak groups and white oak groups in the winter. Buds and bark do have some characteristic differences, but it's not consistent. The buds of our white oak groups are typically more rounded and sometimes hairy. The buds of our red oak group are usually more conical or pointed and mostly smooth, glabrous. The bark of our white oak groups species tend to have a light gray, flaky, or plated bark, whereas the red oak groups, there tend to be a much darker gray or brown that are the ridged and furrowed texture. But the biggest difference between our oak groups in the winter are acorns. White oak groups species only take one growing season, 6 months, for an acorn to mature from flower to mature fruit. Those acorns fall in the fall and they immediately germinate in the ground, forming a new baby tree. Red oak group acorns, they take 2 full growing seasons to mature from flower to mature fruit. So 18 months. That means there's a period in the winter where we can find little adorable baby acorns on the stems of red oak group species. So I see some questions. I just want to make sure I mention. So the old flower created the stipular scar. So the stipule is actually a leafy feature. It's kind of a protective feature within the bud. So it's more leaf-like than it is flowers, associated with the leaves more so than the reproductive structures. At the end, I can try to find a picture. I have a picture of tulip tree stipules that we can show. So let me first show the little adorable baby acorns. For example, on the willow oak here, they look almost like buds. They're really tiny, but the biggest difference is these 2 little curly bits at the tip of the little baby acorns. These are the remnants of the female part of the flower, the stigma, the style and stigma. This is the part of the flower that caught the pollen and is helping to create this acorn. So these are just like brand new ones. These ones are a little bit more developed. You can start to see the acorn cap, but they still have the adorable little curly bits on them. So this is a very consistent feature of our red oak group species. White oak groups will not have any baby acorns on their stems in the winter. So just to, again, keep on our mindset of oaks, to show some of the identifying features of our northern red oak in winter, very conical bud. So like a picture for the red oak group bud characteristics, very pointed, and that dark gray contrasted by the lighter gray uninterrupted ridged and furrowed bark. And of course, we can look on the ground and confirm what we're looking at with leaves. Our white oak, again, is another picture for the characteristic white oak group's features. The buds being much smaller and more rounded. The bark in the upper part of the tree, very thin and flaky. And then as you move down to the lower parts of the tree is much more plated, but a very light gray throughout. And then again, our rounded leaves that we can find on the ground. And the white oak, Quercus alba, is our Maryland state tree. So this is from the Flora, Virginia. This shows the variety of our acorns. And this comes with, I put in some descriptions. I can share, once we share the recording, I can also have a copy of the presentation so that people can reference it beyond this presentation. But again, I just like to show all the variety within our acorns. So sometimes the cap can be identifiable, like how much of the acorn it covers, if they're a little bit scaly. So lots of cool looking acorns. So now another very common feature of our forests alongside oaks are our hickories. We typically describe a lot of our forests as oak hickory dominant. Hickories are identifiable with their compound leaves. Compound leaves have this is a full leaf where the leaf is separated into little leaflets. And the stem of that leaf is called a rachis. And this rachis is much more persistent in the winter. It can be found on the ground below our hickories as well as our walnuts, which are all in the same family, the Juglundaceae. And this rachis that can be found on the ground can be very helpful with identification. For example, the mockernut hickory, Carya tomentosa, the rachis is densely tomentose, tomentose meaning hairy, which relates to the species name of our mockernut hickory. And the black walnut rachis is very long, related to its really long compound leaves. It can be over a foot long and typically curved. In the summer, I always will differentiate between compound and simple leaves. Simple leaves mean only one leaf blade by asking the question, where is the bud? So if I started here at the top of the leaf and I wanted to go down until I found a bud, there's no bud here, no bud here, no bud here. The bud would be down here where the stem is. And that separates our one single leaf. So it's definitely to pay attention to when we're looking at our leaves in the summer. Is it a leaf or is it a leaflet? Always ask yourself that question. This graph actually shows stipules in this case. These are just little leafy features at the bottom of the where the petiole is attached to the stem. All right. So here we can look up close at some of our hickory species. Mockernut hickory, Carya tomentosa. Again, that tomentosa specific epithet, that part of the species name, referring to the densely hairy features of the bud and the stem. So we can see that hairiness just in this picture here. And then we have the bark that's the vertical cracks and seams, but over time it gets very deeply furrowed, more similar to that of oaks. But you can see all these diamond-shaped patterns is what I like to hone in on when I see hickory bark. We have our bitternut hickory, where it's identifying features related to the color of the buds, the yellow sulfur color of our bitternut hickory buds. So, and I describe their buds as being valvate. Valvate means that the buds have two bud scales and they come together and then they open. So valvate means that the buds have two scales. So there's an example from Flora, Virginia to show the distinction between our common hickory nuts. And it includes Carya illinoinensis number 5, which is our pecan. And our black walnut, again, is in the same family as our hickories, Juglundaceae. And this, I love this picture because it shows the long rachis of the compound leaf that will litter the ground around our black walnuts. Their stems are typically very stout, very thick, also very hairy, very pubescent. And the bark is quite dark, rough, and deeply ridged, almost black in color too. So now I'm going to transition into highlighting some of our common trees in the area and the identifying winter features that I pay attention to when I'm trying to identify them in this season. And at the very end, I'm going to go through an example using the winter tree finder and an unknown tree that we're going to try to identify. So our red maple has that very smooth gray bark that does split into these vertical strips. Very colorful stems that, of course, are red. The buds becoming larger as they move further into the winter, as the flowers are getting ready to burst open in the early spring. Silver maple, very similar to the red maple. In the winter tree finder and other keys I use, the biggest distinction between these two in the winter, red maple and silver maple, is actually this odor of the stem. So if you break the stem of the red maple, you're not really going to smell anything. If you break the stem of a silver maple, it's supposed to be really not good. Like it's described as a rank odor. I don't really know if I say it's rank, but it's definitely noticeable. Whereas in a red maple, you won't notice an odor when you break the stem. But again, you can see these rounded flower buds just getting ready to open as we move further into the winter season. Our sugar maples, different in the fact that their stems are not as colorful. Their twigs are just brown. The buds are much more pointed. And the bark is more furrowed or plate-like with age. It starts to really mature. But I think the biggest difference here is the buds, the really pointed buds. The ends of the stems having a terminal bud flanked by two axillary buds. So you kind of end in three for our maples pretty commonly. You can see the three here too, and the three here at the end. But we remember our non-native Japanese maple ends in a pair. So that's a very different feature for our non-native maple. And here it is, the pair of buds at the ends of the twig of Japanese maple, a very smooth bark with vertical striping. I like to refer to it as like a bark that's been scratched by a cat. So that's our Japanese maple. It is a species that can be invasive in the mid-Atlantic. I think that the invasiveness of Japanese maple is really tied to a land use history of an area. So, for example, at Woodland Nature Sanctuary, Japanese maple has become so abundant within our forest because of the history of our property being an estate property with an owner that was very into Japanese horticulture, had lots of Japanese maples planted. Over time, the seeds moved into the forest. Deer were becoming overabundant in this urban area and not eating the Japanese maple seedlings, but pretty much eating everything else. So they became the most common baby tree and regenerating tree within the forest. And there are other other examples within the Mid-Atlantic, like around Philadelphia. I know of a couple of other areas where Japanese maple has become quite abundant. But there is research being done for arboretums to see which varieties of Japanese maples are actually sterile. In the United States, there are 300 varieties available, and worldwide, there are over 1,000 varieties of Japanese maple available. So it's very important in the landscaping industry. So I know there are horticulturists at Longwood Gardens looking into which varieties of the Japanese maples are sterile so that arboretums will ensure to use those varieties only. American elm, and a really important tree here that was influenced by the Dutch elm disease in the past. Its bark is deeply, deeply furrowed when really mature, but I think the bark when it's young is really fun. It's squishy, which is interesting. We don't really associate bark of a tree, bark being close in to wood. We don't really think of that as being squishy on a live tree, but it is. You can actually push into the outer bark of an elm tree, and I noticed the squishiness is much more prominent in higher humidity days. The leaf scars are also arranged alternately, but they actually have another feature that we call two ranked, where the buds occur 180 degrees from each other along the stem. So we have a bud here, and then 180 degrees on the other side of the stem, we have another bud, and it creates this zigzag shape to the stem. So we can see that in the silhouette of the tree. Very challenging to tell the American elm between the slippery elm. They have a lot of very similar features. They are two ranked, alternately arranged, zigzag, squishy bark. But slippery elms do tend to have a kind of gray pubescence to the end of their stems, though I don't think it's really consistent feature. American elm. Now, when we talk about Dutch elm disease, it's important to understand that the Dutch elm disease severely influenced our landscaped elms. Elms are a very popular landscaping tree and were a very popular landscaping tree. But what I've noticed is that the influence on elms within forested areas where they are naturally protected by being in a space with other trees were not as severely influenced. So, for example, at Woodend Sanctuary, elm is our second most common tree species, second most common native tree species within the forest. Now, they're all pretty small, but they're doing really well. Our black gums, Nyssa sylvatica. Oh, so I see another question, Hope, from and Siberian elms. Yes, there are Siberian elms. They are not influenced by the Dutch elm disease, and so they do have the ability to spread. Their flower buds are very prominent. I think their identifying features, the fact that their leaves are much smaller and smooth compared to the rough features of our American and slippery elms. But we also have the lace bark elm or the Chinese elm is another landscape tree that we see. And for the first time, a related species, the Japanese Alcova, which is in the elm family, I've seen a couple of individuals occurring spontaneously along Sligo Creek in Montgomery County. So it's definitely something interesting to keep an eye on. All right, so black gum, its most identifiable features is bark, the plated alligator scale bark that we see on mature individuals. But even on a smaller individuals where this bark has not yet fully developed, we can still identify it. It has these short spur-like branches, which I think of as like slightly bent fingers coming off of the stems. That these spur branches typically end in only a terminal bud. And then the branching structure for this tree is also characteristic. Along the trunk, we'll have branches coming off perpendicular to that trunk, so forming 90-degree angles all throughout. So very, very fun silhouette when looking at black gums in the winter. Other plated bark species includes persimmon. The persimmon will have plated bark even when young. When very young, you can see an orange color in between. But the bark is typically much darker. And then we can see a really fun silhouette of the buds coming off of the stem in the winter. And this is an example of a species that has a pseudo-terminal bud. So this is a bud that was axillary, and this is the rest of the stem that died. So this bud is now at the end of the stem, and it's looking and it's going to act like a terminal bud, but really it developed as an axillary bud, as a lateral bud along the stem. Tulip tree we looked at in when we were practicing our terminology. So we have our stipular scars, I said, is a identifiable feature for our magnolia family. The long terminal buds forming like a duckbill shaped. The ridge and furrowed brown bark that gave the tree the poplar name early on, and why we still sometimes hear tulip tree being called a tulip poplar. The poplars are in the willow family and very distantly related, and not very related to our tulip trees in the magnolia family. So really important to have that distinction. And at the ends of the stems curving upwards towards the sky with the aggregate of fruits, the samaras, these winged seeds held at the tips of branches, ready to spin in the air and spread into new areas. American beech, the brown leaves that persist on winter, the smooth gray bark, the really long 1 inch long pointed buds that you don't want to run into with an open eye in the winter. Black cherry, thin stems, very tiny buds, but the distinctive lenticels. They start to have a horizontal shape when on younger bark, but even when the bark gets scaly, you can still see those horizontal lenticels within the scales. Typically described as having a burnt potato chip look. Sassafras, green, very green, large terminal buds, a green stem. The bark, when mature, very deeply ridged and furrowed, and having a red tinge to it. Our sweet gums, typically the young stems are winged, having that thin flange of tissue. A very large terminal bud that has all of the information necessary for next season's growth. New stem, new leaves, male flowers, female flowers. Those female flowers will form into the sweet gum balls, which will be found hanging on the trees in winter, as well as litter on the ground throughout. Sweet gums are a coastal plain specific species, but we'll see them planted outside of the coastal plain in our landscapes. Hackberry, we mentioned earlier with our warts, very warty bark, but otherwise all the features of hackberry are pretty small. Really small buds, really thin stem. This is another example where the bud here is pseudoterminal. American sycamore. American sycamore is interesting in the fact that the leaves enclose the bud when the leaves are still present on the tree. So when you look at the leaf scar goes all the way around the bud. You can see these bundle scars here. At each point, the little darker spots within the leaf scar. But the winter is a great time to really appreciate the exfoliating bark, showing off the striking white, maybe sometimes reddish color of the inner bark. And then the fruit capsules drooping singly throughout winter. This differentiates between our London plane tree, which instead of singly, our fruit capsules will be usually in groups of 3 together, hanging at the ends of trees of our non-native London plane tree. Flowering dogwood's a great example to differentiate between flower buds and vegetative buds. The onion-shaped flower buds versus the more inconspicuous pointed vegetative buds, and of course the blocky plated bark. Pawpaw, another good example of differentiating flower and leaf buds. The fuzzy spherical flower buds versus the pointed vegetative bud. And then the catalpa, this is the one that has the world arrangement. And then these are, even though they're pod-like, these are bean-like capsules that hang from the ends of stems in the winter. I just want to go through a little dichotomous key practice using the winter tree finder in this unknown species. And then after this, we'll open the floor for any questions that came up throughout the presentation. So the first question in our winter tree finder is asking if our tree is a conifer and needle bearing but sheds its leaf in winter, or not a conifer. So the conifers it's referring to in this example would be bald cypress or larch. But our tree is not a conifer. So we know that it has buds. It has leaf scars that are more similar of a deciduous tree. No cones, no withered needles under the tree. So we're going to go to this symbol on the next page. We're at this symbol, and it's asking again, once we determine that the tree is not a conifer, first question is always going to be about the leaf arrangement. Are the leaves alternate or are they opposite? We have leaf scars occurring singly or leaf buds occurring singly along the stem, so they're alternately arranged, which means we're going to go to this illustration, next page. And it's asking about the twig thickness. It is nice that there is a ruler on the back of the book, so we can measure the thickness of the twig. And we can see that it's not over a half an inch thick. For this second part here, we're going to follow this illustration in the future of the book. And then it asks about all of these, like tons of characteristics, this list of characteristics, where I think the things to really hone in on is that it describes the end bud being larger than the side buds, which we don't have in this case. We have our buds being of similar size, no matter where they are along the stem. So we already don't match the characteristics, which means we're going to follow this illustration on the next page. And then it asks about more bud positioning features, particularly how many buds are at the ends of the twigs. And in this case, we do have a cluster of buds at the ends of twigs. So we actually do have two options. It's either an oak or it's a pin cherry, but we don't have a bark with horizontal lenticels. So we know it's not a pin cherry, and we've already determined that our tree is some type of oak. So here, if we remember when we talked about the differentiation between oak groups, this question is differentiating between our white oak group and our red oak group. The white oak group at the top here, if the bark is light gray, flaky, ridge, and darker gray and older, or the red oak group if the bark is dark, smooth, and shiny, and becoming ridged. We have gray and flaky bark on our tree, so we've already now determined that our tree is within the white oak group. The buds are rounder, buds are pointed. We have very rounded buds in this case. If we can easily rub off a handful of bark scales, or the trunk bark is furrowed and has few scales to rub off, hopefully this will. So we have some bark scales that are pretty easy to remove. Right, so we know we can follow like this little mitten to the next page. The twig is smooth, or the young twigs are covered in a coarse orange brown down or pubescence. We don't have that pubescence, so we know we don't have a post oak. We can keep persisting. And now we actually are on the final couplet. So a couplet being a choice between two options, where either we have an English oak or a white oak. White oaks are definitely the more common one that we'll see in our areas, even though English oaks can be in a planted landscape. But this is another point where I want to show the 90-degree opposite features of the stem arrangements in winter of our white oaks. This again relating to the clustering of buds being so close together that when they open, the stems can appear opposite. But through this winter tree finder, we did identify a white oak. So yeah, this is my favorite little pocket book to use for winter tree identification. So this is just a list of resources that I use to provide the information for today's presentation. And again, I will be sure to share, I think, a PDF version so that it's a little bit easier to send around. That can be sent alongside the recording of the Zoom presentation. And then here's a thank you and my email, my work email for Nature Forward, as well as the email that I use for communications with the as part of the Maryland Native Plant Society board. So I think at this point, we can go ahead and see what questions we have. I'm just reading Steve's question. So first off, I would not describe myself as an arborist. I am not really good at diagnosing trees. I'm not a trained arborist. I'm definitely a trained forest ecologist where I see more, instead of seeing a tree as an individual, I see more so the trees as an ecosystem. And an important part of seeing a tree as an ecosystem is understanding which species you have in that area. So I'm trying to see, as Steve, you asked, can you tell what issues are associated with declining and diseased trees that are easily detected in the winter, or what tree problems are the result of salt, freezing temperatures, and freeze thaw cycles? I don't have an answer. So if anyone wanted to chime in, I'd welcome that. H. Barrett, you asked about the name of the book. Megan shared a link to the Winter Tree Finder on Amazon. Are beeches the only deciduous trees to hold on to their leaves? No. They are one of the more common ones that we associate with holding on to the leaves, but I know are musclewoods or hornbeams. The Carpinus caroliana is another one that commonly holds on to its leaves in winter. If anyone else has other examples, that's like the big one, and that's a good one to pay attention to because a young musclewood and a young beech tree can look very similar. So it's important to look at the features that might differentiate them. For example, the buds of musclewood are going to be very tiny, and the buds of the beech tree are going to be those long 1-inch pointed buds.
I'm not an arborist either, but I do know that this issue of how you tell what the problem is quite challenging, in that it can often take a couple of years post-event for the tree to actually show visible symptoms. So like when we have these drought years, it can take a couple years, and then suddenly your tree looks terrible and you're wondering what happened. And it's because, something happened a couple years ago. So that's makes it really challenging. I think with diseases, one thing I would say is you can use the extension. There's an extension office where you can send samples and ask questions. So if you have something going on with your tree, you can take pictures and send a query in, and they have people who do diagnostics like that. And even sending in samples, they sometimes will test for particular diseases. So that might be helpful if someone's experiencing a problem. So that's all I got for that, though.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Daria asked about an online dichotomous key or app. Of course, iNaturalist is a great community science option. The Virginia Tech Dendrology Department has their own app. Virginia I just had it. Virginia Tech Tree ID. That's a great one to use with them. You could download packs so that you can use it offline as well without access to service. The Florida Virginia has an app as well that's a quarter the price of the physical book. And of course, the nice thing about it being an app is that it updates, which means new species can be added as you're walking around. But the Flora Virginia dichotomous key does not really include a lot of winter features, so tough one to use, but it is very inclusive. I'll go ahead and see, Cheryl, if you'd like to speak up and ask a question.
Yeah, I had asked it on the thread when you showed those lenticels, which of course to me look like a diseased tree to some extent. So how do you tell the difference between a lenticel and some kind of issue with the bark? Or am I
That's
just
a
so
good
off base
question.
on,
I think lenticels, I think it's going to be more of like the consistency. Lenticels are going to be on every single stem and look very similar in shape and size, no matter where you're looking on a tree. So I think that's like a big key to know that like what you're looking at are lenticels and not a disease. Disease is going to be more sporadic, maybe only on a couple of stems, different shape, size, color, even. So that's what I have to say about that.
Okay, sounds reasonable. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Natasha.
Natasha is going to answer a question that somebody else
Yes.
had. So let me read the
Very
question
excited
real
about
quick.
that.
So the question was from, sorry, I want to find the actual person who said it. I have to scroll way up. This was Steve Lonker's question. Can you tell a layperson like myself what issues associated with declining and the diseased trees are especially easier to detect in the winter?
Hi, I'm Natasha Shangold. I'm the forestry inspector for City of Rockville. I'm a certified arborist as well. One thing that I do for detecting trees during the winter to see if they are diseased or dying or declining in the winter is, do they even have a bud to begin with? And it's just a matter of, you just staring at the tree for, a good time. If it's tall, obviously it's a little bit harder, but if it's small, it's very easy. And it takes a lot of practice over time. It's one of those things where it's like you'll get the groove once you get the groove, but that's like my go-to is like, does it actually have a bud? As for the bark itself, yes. Does it have normal features that it should have? So does it have lenticels if it's a cherry? Does it have, chip, a potato chip bark, whatever. So it's just you're trying to find all these features and you're trying to say like, is this what it should have? And if you see anything weird that makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable about the tree, that's when you're like, that might not be a healthy tree, or it might have something going on. Maybe it has, but sometimes we do have native, things that are going on. So you check back in the spring and you see maybe it was just, a gall and it's going to be fine in the spring. So it just takes a lot of, it takes a lot of time and effort and care. And but the trees will tell you what they're doing in the winter. So it's very good to be mindful of that. So I'm happy to provide my email if anyone has any more questions about trees in the winter. But yeah, I really appreciated Bradley's presentation. I always like learning from other great people. So, but yeah, so I hope that answers it. But I will put my email, my work email in the chat, and feel free to reach out to me. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natasha, so much for sharing that information. Yeah, so like I said before, I am definitely not a trained arborist, so it's always fun for me to hear how different people, especially with a different background, view and see trees. We all see trees differently. I've seen a couple of questions or a couple of comments about the leaves persisting on our beeches and oaks in the winter. It is a term called marcescence. If hard to remember that term sometimes, but what I like to call it is stubbornness. They just don't want to let go. And the beeches and the oaks are the common ones that hold on to them. And again, they're related to each other in that Fagaceae family. So you can remember that, oh, brown leaves in winter, it's probably in the beech family. So it's either a beech or an oak. I do tend to notice that younger trees hold on to them more. I don't know if anyone else has observations like that, but I see more mature beeches don't have as many brown leaves in winter, but the more juvenile ones tend to have a lot more leaves in winter. I don't know if anyone else has had a similar experience.
I'll jump in on that one from my past as a developmental biologist in plants. I heard a speaker once describe that the lower branches of trees are, genetically from the younger phase of the plant. And so you'll note that often the leaves are hanging on to the younger, to those branches. So it's something associated with having the earliest branches of a tree. The earliest branches that a tree made tend to hang on to the leaves. So I think there is kind of a trend, especially like the beeches. So I think it's an interesting observation. I didn't follow that research, so I don't know if anybody ever figured out, precisely why, but it is associated with um, those branches that were first formed by the tree as it was growing.
Very
That's my
interesting.
that's my tidbit for the night.
A very interesting theory shared by Margaret about marcescent leaves. We're supposed to make the branches less appealing to ground sloths, not need higher out of reach. Very interesting. I think we can see a lot of evolutionary adaptations related to animals that no longer exist. So what I think of as the thorns of our honey locusts, what are they really protecting themselves from right now? There's not much. There's actually thornless a thornless variety that exists on its own in nature because the thorns are not required to protect the tree anymore from the large mantis and sloths that used to exist here. But they are definitely terrifying. I do love the thorns of honey locusts. Can you share some winter tree ID tips for pignut hickory? Yeah, I shared the tree ID tips for mockernut and the bitternut hickory. So the pignut hickory is going to look very similar to the mockernut in the fact that the terminal bud is going to be larger than the buds along the stem, but the Latin name for pignut hickory is Caria glabra. Glabra relating to the glabrous or smooth features of its stem, so smooth and hairless. When you find a rachis on the ground, the nice thing about the rachis is of the compound leaves is you can actually use it to figure out how many leaflets were on that compound leaf by counting the scars. So similar to a leaf scar, there are leaflet scars on a rachis, and a pignut hickory's compound leaves will always have 5 leaflets. So I'll have 5 scars on that rachis. But it's that the really smooth stems and the large terminal bud are the identifying features that I relate to pignut hickory. So I see there's a couple more hands raised. So Kathy or Jerry, if you want to go ahead.
Hi, yeah. I mentioned the chat that we at our local pool club, we actually have a few elms, a couple of which I planted, but I realized a number of years in that we have an enormous American elm and it's in the middle of a very developed area right now, but it's gorgeous, and I would like to make sure that we keep it that way. So I was wondering if you had any tips for it's literally it's at the edge of it's between the parking lot and the pool. So it's it's got roots under pavement, and
Yeah.
it's interesting. It's like right at the edge of the fence. So I really want it to survive.
Yeah, I think one of my things for mature trees that have gone this long is just a do nothing approach. It's obviously done pretty well so far, and it's interesting to have a large American elm that's in a developed area that probably wasn't affected by the Dutch elm disease. I'm curious if it's in a property that would be treating the
No,
tree
I
to.
mean, Yeah, I mean it's our so it's our pool club. We have, a number of acres. I mean not a huge amount, but it's in Wheaton. It's right next to Sligo Creek Park. And so originally when the pool club was developed, it's called Parkland because there was nothing else around it. So that tree probably is from then. And when it was first developed, so it's about, at least 70 years old, probably more. So yeah, I don't know why it survived. Other than that, I don't think there's any other elms around. So maybe for whatever reason, it was what do you call it? A wolf tree, a lone American elm in that part of the forest.
Pasture tree sometimes.
Maybe, yeah. It's there was way back, Sligo Creek Park, that area, there was farming and a lot of deforestation. So maybe, yeah. Anyway, but I really want to keep it healthy because a lot of the oaks are dying, and we didn't talk about that because this is an ID class, but yeah.
So, I mean, that's a more complicated thing. Oak decline is not associated with one single factor. It's more so death by 1,000 cuts, and the fact that the oaks that we're seeing, particularly in our landscapes, are remnants of the more mature forest that existed, and they've been developed around them, and all these other changes that are happening kind of creates this death by 1,000 cuts scenario. There's some really good online information about that. But for the elm, naturally, there's always going to be some trees that are going to survive. They'll have the genetics that make them able to persist in the face of a disease or a threat. There actually is an app that you can use called Tree Snap, where you can record trees that are being influenced by diseases, so you can report them and then people can come and look at them and be like, hey, why is this one doing so well? And American elm is one of the species on that.
Now that's interesting. If we could get the link, that would be great.
Yeah, it's called Tree Snap. I've done a few, particularly I look for ones that like American chestnut. I remember I was near Blacksburg, Virginia, and I found an American chestnut on a trail that had a fruit, and of course I reported that one. That was really cool. But I'll give the floor to Anne to see what she's wondering.
Yeah, I live on 6 acres and we have a number of white oaks. Most of them are pretty mature and, are branched out, starting not too much, probably like at 8 feet. We have this one that had once been surrounded by other trees, probably pine, and that have been removed. And it has a very long, straight trunk. But what I notice about it is it's obviously younger than a lot of the other white oaks we have, just because of the size of the diameter of the trunk. But at any rate, what I notice is there's all these little flakes of bark that have shed and they're on the ground around this tree. Is that a normal feature of a white oak as it grows?
That's a great question. I don't know. Has anyone else noticed this feature of a young white oak? I can't say I have.
When I say young, it's not, it's probably like 50 years old.
If we can recall the picture I showed of the white oak bark when I was doing the presentation, is that those pieces can be very flaky, and similar to how sycamores shed their outer layer of bark in large sections, I wouldn't be surprised if white oak does the same.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Or someone asked about the nature park where I work. It's Wooded Nature Sanctuary in Chevy Chase, Jones Mill Road.
This has been very informative, Bradley. Really appreciate it. Lots of people are saying thank you and informative in the chat. That it's a great program, and I agree. I think a lot of people are trying to figure out excuses to get out in the winter. And winter tree ID is definitely a good one. And I want to make a comment that I've actually found it in some cases easier to ID a tree in the winter than in the growing season, because certain features like the buds are so very distinctive. And I see that Lauren is sort of shaking her head, yes. All right. Well, thanks again. Thank you, Bradley, and thank you everyone for joining us.